No, but she told me she needs to go. Yeah. All right. Okay. No, I was just kidding lah. Okay. I think you all should know me by now, right? If you don't know me by now, then I cannot do anything. Anyway, let's continue. Okay. All right. So what we want to do, right, is to run through, some background first, right? Then we'll go into some of the activities that the individual criminal tribunals, have undertaken, and provide a critique, right? So remember, like what I pointed out to you, you need to think about things that will contribute to a critique, all right? I would still take a more of a sorry, sorry. Uh, okay, sorry. I would still take a kinder, softer, gentler view of the criminal tribunals and even of the ICC, right? But I think it should also not be a case where we give it, too positive a review, right? So you must include arguments that are related to, number one, institutional empowerment, right, which makes it, important and powerful. Number two, you must include arguments that are related to, like what I mentioned just now, the logic of deterrence, the logic of delays, right? In bringing justice, right, and then also the cost that is involved, right. So these are the, I would say, going into the specifics, right. These are actually like the main arguments or the main contention points that you should include in your exam answer. All right. Kant's Means and Styles, has got a good overview of, some of these things where I took this out from. I've given you links to the ICTY, ICTR website. They're actually very interesting to take a look at if you have time, right? Honestly, right? If you have time, I would suggest that you go and have a look see around the website, right? Because they have indicated some specific cases and so on. I pulled out just the statistics only. I didn't go into the specific cases and all, right? Because I mean that would be too much detail, that to include. What we want to look at is the evaluation, right? But it is very well organized, right? Both of the organizations are very similar to each other, all right? So we're talking about ICTY, it's similar talking about the ICTR. The ICTY has had more updates than the ICTY. Sorry, ICTR. The ICTR, they stopped updating their website, I think, around 2019. So that's all the statistics we have, right? But the ICTY, has continued to be updated with some of the more recent developments. So that is something that you do want to pop by the website and take a look at. Okay, all right. There's some very nice videos also. Done up by the ICTY, ICTR, as well as ICC subsequently. So all of that is very rich in the sense that explains the overview to you, right? Easy to digest. So I would recommend, if I've linked any videos for you and so on, please, do watch. Take a little bit of time and do watch it, right? Because they're actually quite well produced. Okay, all right. It's not those glorifying kind of videos like you see with some of the IOs, right? They say we've done this, we've done that. This is what we intend to achieve and so on. It's a very honest take, right? I feel maybe I was partial to it, but I felt that it was a very honest take on the activity. So please do take a look at it. Okay, all right. So what you want to explain, right, is that war crime tribunals, they're not actually new, right? Okay, it was actually first established post World War II, right? So they're actually not new, but subsequently they wanted to address, specifically the atrocities in former Yugoslavia as well as in Rwanda. So that's where you get establishment of the individual criminal tribunals, the ICTY and the ICTR. Basically it was prompted by this frustration, right, where they were unable to sorry they were unable to bring to justice all of these people who had committed crimes knowingly, right, and they didn't want to use military force and have an incursion into each of these states, right. So basically what they wanted to do was giving in to also pressure by human rights activists, right. The UN basically decided to establish the two different tribunals, right, in 1993 and in 1994, right. I would make reference to the last point, right? Saying that it is pursuant to the UN Charter, right, and specifically to the act, right, or the chapter which refers to the respect or to threat to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression, right. So the rationale is that it comes parked under these crimes of against humanity or crimes of aggression, right, comes under the logic of being threatening to peace and so on. Okay, so that is what you want to highlight. What you also want to highlight, right, is this. Can you see that point where I say prodding by human rights activists, right? So what you want to include also, right? We don't look at it specifically in this course, right? But I think it is important in IR that we consider when we talk about non-state actors, because IOs are non-state actors, right? And when we talk about non-state actors, I think sometimes it's also important to look at how non-state actors like IOs, they collaborate with other non-state actors, or they engage in capacity building, right, with in conjunction with other non-state actors, right. So NGOs become significant, activists become significant as well, right. So it is this logic about that, what constitutes the international community, because so far, right, we always focus our attention on the composition of international community being states and IOs, right, non-state actors, right? But this is, and I've mentioned this before, I think in the intro lectures and so on, like how you've got other non-state actors that do work with IOs, right? So this would be a point that you want to illustrate, right? It is willing, the UN was willing to, take heed to the whether it's a prodding by the activists, or whether it's a request, or whether the UN felt pressured and buckled under the pressure. That's that is one thing, right? But the fact is that they eventually took paid attention, right, to these other non-state actors, right, and basically work with them in that sense, right. So I think that is also an important point that you can include, right, if you would like, right. Just giving you see the idea here. I do not want you. I know we mentioned so many different things, right? So I do not want you to feel pressured today. I include every single one of these arguments. The logic is that I want to give you as many ideas as possible, or prompt as many ideas as possible, and use whatever you feel, right, works for that argument that you are crafting, right. So these are just suggestions only. I'm not saying you must include everything. There are certain things I say you must include, right, but there are certain things I say these are ideas for you to think about. Okay. Important down here, right, when you talk about ICTY, ICTR versus ICC, right, is that ICTY, ICTR, they are ad hoc. They are not permanent, right? So they have actually already closed down, right? ICTR closed in 2015, whereas ICTY closed in 2017. Remainder of the cases that they already started investigation in and so on, right, have either been passed over to what they refer to as the mechanism, right, or it has been passed over to the national courts, the domestic courts. That means within Rwanda, within Netherlands, right? Okay, sorry, not Netherlands, within Yugoslavia, right? Okay, it's been passed over to them already, right? And these courts have been closed. So this is very different, right, from the ICC. Okay, ICC has got temporal and spatial jurisdiction. Temporal means time. Spatial means space, right? That means across time and across country, right? The jurisdiction, right, that the ICC enjoys is actually very different, right? Like I was telling Gabriel just now, right? If I remember correctly, ICC has got the authority to probe into any case that has occurred, I think, after 2001, if I remember correctly. I'm quite sure it's 2001, around that period. So the rationale here is that given the fact, okay, and you're going to play up on this point, right? Because this will go. Maybe you want to write this down, right? Because this will go directly into the evaluation of the ICC, right? Because these are ad hoc, right? They empowered them to quite a large extent, right? Meaning that the decisions that the ICTY, ICTR made, right? They are not something that has to be subservient to domestic law of Rwanda or domestic law of Yugoslavia, right? Whereas when you look at the Rome Statute under the ICC, right, it was actually, if we say this one was empowered, right, that one was de-empowered. That is, it was an important source of legitimation, an important source of power that was taken away from the ICC because it was permanent, right? And because it is able to cast its judicial net way wider than the ad hoc tribunals of ICTY, ICTR. So this is an important point that you do need to highlight because it's directly related to the effectiveness of the ICTY, ICTR on one hand, and the ineffectiveness of the ICC on the other hand. The very fact that this is ad hoc. So because it's ad hoc, right, it is something that could be closed down. They had a very restricted temporal jurisdiction. They're very restricted spatial jurisdiction, specifically looking at crimes, during Rwandan genocide, or specifically looking at the crimes during former Yugoslavian, the genocide of former Yugoslavia, right? So it is less threatening, right, to the states, or less threatening to great powers, less threatening to the individuals or the politicians, right? So that is something that you want to definitely, include when you discuss this, right? So the mechanism, that's what I was referring to, right, is the mechanism that carries on the legacy of the ICTY, ICTR. So when you go to the website or you look at the statistics like I pulled up for you, right, they make reference, they say how many cases have been passed over to the mechanism to continue, because that means they've already conducted a good deal of investigations, right, and it's just a little bit more to go, or some of the cases have been transferred over to the domestic courts. What that also suggests, right, is that, these, although they were ad hoc, the legacy that they have is very great. Why? Because cases get transferred either to the mechanism, right? That means you created another, subset or another organ, right, to deal with these issues. Number two, right, if you are transferring these cases over to the domestic courts, that suggests also that the domestic courts must be adequately equipped to deal with these cases, right? So that tells you, right, that, that enough preparation of the domestic courts has been taken, right, so that these cases can be passed over. So you've got a strengthening of the domestic, legal regime within the two states as well, right? Okay. So that is the, the point that you can, emphasize, right? Both of it, ICTY, ICTR, elaborate on the Geneva Conventions, right? Basically that looks at the basic rights of wartime prisoners, right? And, they basically, thinking about, establishing these precedents, right? In thinking about how to expand the idea, apply and subsequently expand the idea of international humanitarian law, right? So international humanitarian law is not something that is abstract, but now can be broken down, can be applied to individuals, because that is what, the ICTY, ICTR is basically about, right? Just now Gabriel asked me this question, and I want to bring this up here, right? Because he asked a specific question about, the application of the theories like liberalism and realism and, and so on, right? So I was telling him, and some of you may have heard it, right, that, apart from the, bringing in of the theories like, say, for example, liberalism, to explain how, ICTY, ICTR, is a regime, right, because it is basically a legal regime that you're referring to, right? It is a little bit more difficult to, apply the usual way we take, perspective of, liberalism and realism and constructivism. Maybe you could, apart from applying it to the idea of the regime, maybe you could also think of it like, say, for example, what do the liberals and what do the realists say about humanitarian intervention? I think I've mentioned this to you before, right? The realists have got very clear position on intervention, and this idea of humanitarian law and so on, because the realists say that state is supreme, right? That's what the realists say, right? The state is supreme. It's a statist approach. And, non-state actors basically have got, we've invested too much, unnecessary faith in them. They are just representatives of great state power. So there is no way, right, that humanitarian intervention is something that is, going to be easily accepted by those that are wearing their realist lenses. Those that are wearing the liberalist lenses are divided, right? Some point to the idea that, sovereignty is enshrined in the charter of the UN, right? So, even though you have international organizations that are dedicated to, the strengthening or the upkeep of international regimes, right, the sovereignty of states still should be protected. the Marxists are very similar to the liberals, right? Sorry, the Marxists are very similar to the realists and to the liberals who say that sovereignty is significant, because similar to the realists, the Marxists, would say that, look, all of these international organizations and regimes, right? What are they there for? They are there just to satiate and to carry out the wishes of, the bourgeois class, right? Which is, the core states or the bourgeois states or the, great powers, right? Whereas, the goal of Marxism is the emancipation of the proletariat. And, therefore, the proletariat doesn't get representation in any of these international organizations, right? So in relation to, humanitarian intervention, this is what, the various theories, basically highlight. When is it, possible to intervene or not? The only one, where is, it's a bit more open to interpretation is the other, group of liberals who say, um, while state sovereignty is something to be respected, right? We also believe, right, that like what I mentioned earlier, right, sovereignty is a right to be earned, right? It's a privilege. It's not it's not something that is just a foregone conclusion. It's a privilege that needs to be maintained, right? So there are certain conditions under which it becomes legitimate, right, for the international community to intervene. So if you look at it, from like when can you intervene, when can you apply international law, humanitarian law, you would look at it from these perspectives. But other than that, right, for this topic per se, it's difficult to just come out right and apply like a liberalist explanation or a realist explanation, because we're looking at individuals, right? And then we're looking at how the international organization responds to these individuals. So you have to, if you are applying the theories, you have to come at it from that direction. Okay. Where I would apply the realist liberalist logic also, right, is I think more so not for this topic, but more so for the ICC, right, which would be a case where you would say that states are wearing their realist lenses, like what I mentioned about the US just now, right, not wanting to be party, not wanting to be a party state, not wanting to ratify it domestically because you're fearful of how then the ICC can be, come and, open up investigations into you. So for selfish reasons, right, then states may be considering that their national interest is supreme as opposed to the interest of the entire international community. And therefore, you want to have an organization to deal with things like crimes against humanity, right? So states wearing the realist lenses obviously would put their own state interest first. And they put their own state interest first, and if they're actually guilty of some of these crimes, right, then obviously they do not want to be party to it. Party to it as in like state parties, right, which is members of the organization. So that is where I think you can bring in the logic of the theories, right? Other than that, you notice that this argument, roughly we just look at how they function and so on. Okay. All right, so that's the scope that we would think about. Okay, all right, because I got reminded of this and I connected it to Gabriel's question, right? Because we talk about the application of international humanitarian law, right? So that's where I made that connection, right? And I explained this logic down here. So like I always say, right? If it's necessary, then bring it in. Right. So, if you don't think that it's necessary to bring this argument about the realist, liberalist, and Marx, we don't look at Marxism, but realist, liberalist, and so on. If you think that it's not necessary, it clouds the entire discussion, then you don't have to bring it in. Right. But if you do want to bring it in, for a particular reason, of the question asks you to look at different theories relating to the application of humanitarian law, or how do we look at the application of theories to international organizations that deal with humanitarian law and so on, right? Then you want to find a way to bring it in. You can bring it in this way. Okay. Like I mentioned, your Bailey's textbook, right? Bailey's textbook has got some good discussions relating to humanitarian intervention, right? I can't remember what the chapter is called. I think it's by Amitav Acharya. I think I could be wrong. But there is a chapter in Bailey's textbook that talks about intervention, right? Humanitarian intervention and human security. So you can, if you want a little bit more detail on that, you can take a look at it. Or if you want me to give you an explanation on Humanitarian Intervention, actually, I've got some slides already done up for a different class. I can always share them with you, right? Okay. So just let me know if somebody wants to be brave enough to ask for it. You email me and let me know, and I'll just upload it for you. Okay, I can extract it from that set and upload it. Okay. But otherwise, it's actually available in the Baylis textbook. You can easily access it. Okay. All right. So let's look at these are the videos I was telling you. Right. They are actually very good to watch. Right. Very sad to watch, but they're good for you in the sense that it gives you an idea of what the two organizations were about, right? Okay. So these are the latest statistics. I updated it for you. As of 2021, right? 161 indicted, sentenced 91, right? When they say sentence, it means that they're formally accused or charged with the crime. Two ongoing cases that were passed on to the mechanism, right? 37, we either withdrawn or they subsequently passed away as a result of old age and so on, right? Or committing suicide. Very few lah, but you do have those that did commit suicide. Like I cannot remember who it was. It's in the video. Anyway, and then subsequently you got a bunch of them who are also referred to the national jurisdictions as well, right? What you want to also mention, right, is that very high profile cases, right, that have actually lent a lot of credibility. So former Yugoslavia president, right, Milosevic, which I mentioned to you earlier on, who was found not guilty eventually, unfortunately, for ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo, right? He died, during trial. Then 10 years later, in 2016, was when they basically, passed the verdict, right, and said that unfortunately we don't have enough evidence, so we're clearing him of everything, right? So this is the background to it. I think if you do mention the ICTY, right, providing a bit of background, like how you provide a background in Rwandan genocide, would be necessary. So just briefly, right, doesn't have to go into too much detail, right? But what you want to convey is that why this is considered to be heinous, right? So that's why I've got the details there for you, right? You've got ethnic cleansing, you've got killing almost 8,000 Muslim men and boys and so on, right? So this is what you need to put in, right? Okay, all right, when you discuss these ideas here, okay, all right. Then also you want to talk about the accomplishments, right? So like what I mentioned to you earlier on, I already mentioned this to you under the positive aspects and the negative aspects of the war crime tribunals. So you just take those ideas and you basically replicate them with a little bit more context, right? If you're referring to ICTY, right? So you've got developing these the procedures, to establish facts, to prove the crimes, and so on. You provide the victims a forum to be heard. You've got, basically remember when we talk about law, right? The whole important thing about law, when you talk about judiciary, and you talk about law, right? When we say, what is the role of the judiciary? The role of the judiciary is to interpret law, right? So the important point down here is that these kinds of tribunals, basically, they flesh out, right, international laws on war crimes, because you have the standard law, right? In each of these individual scenarios, how is this law applicable to this particular case, right? So that is where you get the development and the strengthening of the legal regime, right? Okay, so that is one way to look at it, because it's a fleshing out of the laws. So if you get that question, remember I mentioned that question to you earlier on, the strengthening of the legal regime, right? This is how you would go about interpreting and creating different arguments, right, within that discussion. Second point, right, if I said like I gave you that question just now, if you find that it is too tough, in terms of fleshing the ideas out, in talking about what is the legal regime, what do we mean by strengthening it, how do these organizations contribute to it, if you think that it's too technical in nature, right, then reconsider your choice for question, even though you may have prepped for the topic, right? So this is why I always tell you all, you cannot afford to X out too many topics, because if you're banking on the ICC and then some really weird wacky question comes out on it that has got terms that are difficult to interpret, right, then you're going to be stuck, right? And we do not want to be stuck, right? So that's the rationale down here. Okay, extremely high cost given the technicalities, right? Cost estimated in 2012-2013, just before they started to close down, right? I think about 10 years into the establishment of the ICTY, they had spent about $250 million, right? And then some of these critics basically asked, $250 million, right? 10 years into establishing of this organization, total you only, managed to sentence how many, right? You indicted 161, only sentenced 91 people at the end of the day, right? So worth it or not, right? The opportunity cost, transaction costs involved, right, are so high, right? But then the other, that would be one set of arguments, right, that some of the critics have. Is it really worth it? Is ICC also worth it, because they've basically burnt millions and millions of dollars at the head, right? And have got very few cases that basically they managed to try. So the rationale, that is one side of the argument. Flip it on its head. The other side of the argument is that, is there a price that that you can name for human lives, right? If you say, is it worth it, $250 million for only this many people being sentenced and tried, right? But rationally, if you think about it, can we say that this one life is costs this much money, and then we can justify the cost, right? So there's always a way for you to flip it around. So this topic, I like this topic very much, because it's if you are the argumentative type, right, and you are able to play around with these arguments, right, you will have a lot of fun writing an answer on this, because you can basically play at devil's advocate and show two sides of it, and then and please, if you're going to play around with the arguments and turn it on its head, please eventually come to a conclusion. Don't play around the arguments and then leave both of them hanging at the end of the day without a conclusion, right? Okay. And then the last one, right, which is what I highlighted to you, right? Eventually, because the ICTY was the one that started first, right? It's considered to be a trailblazer that paved the way for ICTY, ICC, right? So if you look at just the ICC, then you would say ICTY, ICTR, the successors, right? Then made it more important, all the more important, for the ICC to be established, right? So that is, how you would phrase it, right? So at the end of the day, no matter how, whether you say it is very costly, whether you say, they have not indicted enough people, they've not sentenced enough people, right? You would still say that, it plays a very big role, right, in actually having proven, right, why a tribunal is so important and mooted, the establishment of the ICC eventually, right? So you make that connection down there, okay? All right. So when you have, the origins of the ICTY, right? So basically, what you were, what you want to always provide a little bit of background. Like I gave you the background to the genocide. Here you want to provide a background as to how, basically, it all came about, right? So you've got, remember just now you all mentioned, why, where, what kind of context in which these occur, right? And then you all mentioned like weak institutions. You mentioned, there's the stereotypical characteristics of not being able to provide, public goods and services, poor governance and so on, right? So you've got the collapse, right, of the Soviet Union. You've got power vacuum, right? So these are the typical arguments. If I was marking a paper, on this, right, I would expect to see some of these key terms being mentioned: weak institutions, poor governance, power vacuum, failed state, collapsing state, and so on. Why? Because that sets the context. It's a typical IR description of a state and an explanation of why conflict occurs in the first place. Conflict doesn't sprout out of nowhere, right? So you have to make that connection. Some students will just say there was a genocide. Why was there a genocide? And how is it that it requires the international community to intervene, right, and put a stop to it, because your domestic structures are not strong enough. That is why it becomes important for the international community and an international organization to be established. An NGO cannot deal with it, right? The domestic courts cannot deal with it. You need to have the strengthening of the international legal regime in order to deal with these issues, right? So only when you mention these kinds of things, right, then the argument basically becomes stronger, right? And it becomes more IR oriented. There's a difference between just telling the story about the ICTY and ICTR, right? Like how the videos basically look like, versus how you would write an answer, right, in an IR exam, right? And you want to include all of these IR related concepts for the analysis, right? So that is where you get the difference between a descriptive answer and an analytical answer. The analytical answers are the ones who are going to hit the 60 and above grade. When the answer, I mean, basically that's how I look at it also, right? And when I look at the papers that come back from UK or whichever, right, you can basically see, right, the descriptive answers are the ones that are the 40 something, the 50 somethings. Even those students write a lot, right? So think about how you want to score and what you want to include, okay? All right. So you've got, the power vacuum, and then you've got, the large scale violence, as a result of the hostilities and so on, right? Okay. So civil war, or otherwise what is referred to as international armed conflict. Please underline that. Please underline that in case, international armed conflict. In case, right, the examiners use that in the phrasing of the question. Then you're like, we never examine international armed conflict, what? Then how? I cannot answer this question. They're testing me on things that are outside of the syllabus. Actually, not. They're actually referring to the logic of the civil war, right? Okay, or civil conflict. Okay, all right. And and this is where you get, the logic of the internal armed conflict. Sorry, I was referring to internal armed conflict. Internal, that's the one I want you to underline, right? Internal armed conflict, right? And the international armed conflict, how this basically intersect, right? So where you have it becomes a dire situation. That is why, right, the international community needs to get involved, right? Because it's not something that is now restricted only to the territory of the individual state, right? You've got, in the first place, you've got high number of casualties. Then you've got displaced people, the disenfranchised, the displaced, right? Who are, running out of the state, mass exodus, refugees, and so on, asylum seekers and everything, right? So basically, the UN, wanted to investigate if international crimes had been, had been committed. Of course, we know that international crimes have been committed, but the rationale is that it must fit, particular established conventions, right? It must fit the definition, because remember, go back to the idea of what international organizations are, right? They are the ones that define what an issue is. Like, say, for example, the UN Commission on the Refugee, right? They are the ones that define what is a refugee. IMF and World Bank, they are the ones that define what is it that constitutes, debt. What is it that constitutes, developmental programs, right? And what is it that, constitutes good business and so on, right? So they are the ones that come up with the standards, the yardsticks, right? So of course, the UN needs to establish whether indeed, based on the legalities, because remember, international organizations, they are juridical in nature. Remember, they are legal. They're based on law. They're legal based, right? So it has to go through the proper channels. So don't take this as like a criticism, right? And say, of course, crimes have occurred. Why is the UN still attempting to establish? But as a result of what the nature of international organizations are, right, then you would need to go through the proper procedures. And the UN basically found ample evidence, right, of violations of international humanitarian laws, including the violation of the 1949 Geneva Convention, right? And therefore you have the establishment, it mooted the establishment, of the ICTY. Okay, all right. All right. So based on the report, right, and there was, increasing, pressure by your your human rights activities and so on, right? Basically, they passed Resolution 827, right, and established the ICTY in The Hague. So number two, right, another thing that you want to mention related to this first one I talked about was the juridical nature of international organizations. Second point, right, you can actually borrow this, right, and fit it into an evaluation of the UN, right? Because remember, we have a lot of criticisms relating to the UN, and we highlight, remember that meme that I showed you, and it says that this resolution is like a donut, it's got a hole in it, right? Okay, the logic here is that there's been a lot of criticisms against, the activities of the UN, that it deters, that, it's unable to make, decisions and so on, right? But this is one of the very useful things that they did do, correct? They got it correct, right? And then, like we said, the ICTY paved the way for the ICTR and subsequently the ICTR. So the UN is the one that mooted the entire investigation, right? And agreed that yes, we should indeed establish the tribunal. right? So that would be a point that you could use, in an argument that you are writing about the UN. That means the question is not about the ICTY, right? But you use this argument from the ICTY, right, in relation to an answer about the UN, the effectiveness of the UN, or you get questions relating to the humanitarian aspect of the UN, like in what ways has the UN contributed to the international legal regime? What ways has the UN contributed to upholding of human rights? How has it contributed to protecting humanity or humankind? Right. So you will talk about healthcare aspect. You talk about maternal care, maternal health. You talk about human development, sustainable development goals. You talk about their food programs, the water security programs, and so on. And this can be another argument that you can include, right? So the marker will be like, okay, not only have you concentrated, on the activities of the UN relating to the traditional arguments, but you also looked at, externally, what other kind of organizations has it helped to spawn, right? And how significant were these organizations that it did indeed help to spawn? So it's a much more comprehensive answer than just, going the run of the mill, discussion about human security and so on, right? So what is the scope of, your understanding of human security, or your scope of understanding of, humanity? How does it contribute to, to protecting humanity or upholding anything related to that? Okay. All right. So these are the ways you utilize the arguments. Okay. All right. All right. Then you look at the ICTR. Okay, when you look at the ICTR, these are some of the things you want to, put up, right? 93 individuals, right? They concluded proceedings for about 80, right? There are about 6 fugitives running around, right? These are the latest, statistics that are available as of 2019, right? That, very high profile cases, right? The highest authority, right, in the Rwandan Defense Ministry, as well as the former Prime Minister, right? And this one was very important. Please underline that, right? The last point on this slide, right? In the case of Jean-Paul Akeyesu, right, where the court concluded, right, for the very first time that rape, right, is a crime of genocide, right? Okay, prior to this, rape had never been classified, right, as a crime, even though it has been used time and time and again in several of these different crimes that have occurred, right? Even in the cases of private corporations who want to engage in land grabs, they want to evict people out of their places and so on, right? Rape has always been, unfortunately, a tool, right? That has been weaponized, right? And in the first time ever, right, they actually classified it, right? So this is a very important point, right? Just like how you want to highlight, these are the highlights, the trailblazing, aspects of it, right? This one, is something that you definitely want to include, right? Okay. All right. Okay. So when you look at the institutional origins, right, basically it was, I have a little bit of a background on the Rwandan genocide, right? So this one I think, is quite, clear to you, right? I'm not going to run through that, right? So, inspired by the ICTY, right, the United Nations Security Council, they created the tribunal in Tanzania, right? And it was basically created in the image of ICTY, right? So, that's why we say ICTR, ICTY is, like a trailblazer, right? And basically, they both have, nearly identical statutes, right, and institutional designs, right? So this is, significant. They even shared the same prosecutor, even up to about 2003, right? So there was very close, mirroring of each of these organizations, right, that you wanted to, highlight. Okay, all right. Okay. All right. So the combined assessment, right, of the origins, right, what you want to, explain, right, is that, they were ad hoc, right? So they were never meant to be long term, right? But because they were so successful and they managed to, address so many different issues, that's why you got the permanent ICC that was subsequently established, right? And then, they were just, basically, looking at the individual jurisdictions. So remember just now I mentioned the temporal and the spatial jurisdiction, right? That would be a good phrase to use because it's it's like it's an academic term, right, to refer to what scope they have, how far they can cast their judicial net, right? So that is what you want to refer. So their, temporal and spatial jurisdiction is restricted, right? To the specific incidents that happened, right? In 2004, right, they began to wind up operations, right? Because like I said, it was never meant to be permanent, right? And they attempted, to complete all the appealing, all the appeal proceedings by 2010, right? But they, because of the sheer amount of work that was actually involved, right, they were unable to do so. So they basically attempted to have an extension of the deadlines. You will understand what I mean when you watch the video, right? When you watch the behind the scenes video, and when they show you particularly the registry, right, which is like this part of the secretariat where they collect all the evidence and all the statements and everything, right? It's basically like a room full of files and boxes and boxes and boxes of these files, that have all of these hard evidence, right? So of course, it's going to take time to go through all of that material, right? So that is why the logic of the time and the money spent, right, is being highlighted, right? Okay, so what you want to explain, right? This one is just examples to illustrate, why there were delays and so on, right? And how many that how many cases they had completed and whatnot, right? But I think more importantly, right, those two are just illustrations on the top. The last point is the one that is significant, right? Like which I kind of talked about already. There were a lot of delays, right, in terms of the late arrest of the remaining fugitives. Like I said, they were at large, right? So for example, like the last of the fugitives, right, Govan Hadzik, right, he was only arrested in July 2011, which was actually past the deadline that they imposed for themselves to complete, and wrap up the tribunals, right? So that is, one issue, right? And I think the other thing is that the complexity of the cases, right? The sheer complexity of the cases and the amount of detail involved, right? So, the completion estimates had to be, revised. I would say this is a plus point that they revised their completion estimates and the winding up strategy. Why? Because it wasn't a rush job. It wasn't a case where you say, okay, we are supposed to close by this time. Okay, let's just finish it up. Doesn't matter whether there are, those running around the place or not, fugitives, or whether, there are some issues that haven't been resolved. We'll just, deal with whatever that we have on our hands and then forget it. The domestic, courts can, take over the rest, right? But they did their due diligence, right? So this is a plus point, right? Then the other one also, developments related to the health of detainees can cause delays to the tribunal's work. If you watch the video, especially the video related to the detention center, right? I think it's called the UNDU, if I'm not wrong, right? And it's a detention center. You will notice that they the detainees, right, or those who have been arrested have actually been very, or at least what they showed in the video, right? They've been taken. There's been good care taken of them, right? A bit of the logic of innocent until proven guilty, right? So they have regular health checkups. The detention center is well structured. They have some comforts in the sense that they're not treated badly and so on, right? And of course they have, like I mentioned, the health is taken into consideration, right? So by the time they recover and so on, then it makes a delay in the process and so on, right? So that is something that you want to include also, right? So when you talk about the delays, right, while the delay corresponds to the amount of the costs, right, the extraordinarily high cost, right, and this can be taken as a negative point, you can soften that criticism, right, by saying that these delays are not something that is as a result of dithering in terms of the appellate, or they were ineffective, the secretary was ineffective, they didn't collect evidence and so on. These were things that worked against them, right? So it's not in their favor. Okay, all right, so be careful when you critique lah. Okay, all right. So how do they work, right? Basically, what you want to look at, right, is that what is it that they were actually responsible for. So that means go to the core function of the organization, right? Okay, so they're responsible for the investigation, adjudication of three types of international crimes genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Underline that one because that whole phrase is important, right? If you were going to start off a discussion or you wanted to say that, okay, this is the role and function of the ICTY, ICTR, that's what they're supposed to do. All right, okay, so they are responsible, right, for the investigation and adjudication. So not only they're not just there, to say that, it's like, say for example, you've got some of these tribunals that have got you know independent lawyers who go and gather information and then they submit it to the tribunal. The tribunal just makes a case for it. Like, say for example, I think some students brought up in another class, this independent tribunal that is related to the Xinjiang case, the Xinjiang the accusation of the genocide in Xinjiang. So some students wanted to make reference to that. Then I said, look at what that tribunal is actually about. It's an independent tribunal, right? It is something that is not official. It's a bunch of experts, industry experts, and lawyers and so on who come together. They did their own independent investigations and they had their own independent ruling. That is very different. That is also ad hoc, right? But that is very different from the official status, right, that this ICTY, ICTR enjoy. I make this point because that Xinjiang one was a development that occurred fairly recently. I think end of last year, if I remember correctly, where they released their findings and they said that, oh yes, there are atrocities, but I think at the end of the day they also did not provide any kind of hard evidence. So if you are making any reference to how ICTY, ICTR inspire other tribunals and so on, be careful, right, about what you are making reference as to what it has inspired, number one. Number two, be careful also because that one is a little bit sensitive as well, right? So think a little bit carefully about what you're relating these tribunals. So I mentioned this because I suddenly remembered it. Okay. All right. So basically, that's the main responsibilities of ICTY, ICTR, right? And both of them basically, their subject matter, right? Jurisdiction is almost identical, right? They were basically looking at, within that confines of the conflict, in that particular state, what are the violations of international humanitarian law, right? And they were both, basically, established that, that they would basically hold individuals rather than states responsible. Please underline that because that's also a very important point, right? It is not the state that is responsible for these crimes, but these individuals who are representatives of the state. So it's slightly different, right? So you want to pay attention to that, right? And there's a major difference. That's why I say there's a major difference from moving from personal, right, to temporal jurisdiction, right? Okay, so that is what you want to make sure that you emphasize, that is holding individuals, right, responsible for it. Okay, all right. ICTY, right, created to try, right, anything that occurred on the former Yugoslavia after 1st January 1991, right, and then ICTR was specifically looking at the Rwandan genocide only, right, which was 1st January to 31st December 1994. That's why I mentioned, how it is more restricted. Because it is more restricted, it was seen as less threatening by those who basically are inherently guilty, right? Otherwise, okay. All right, let's look at some of the organs, right? Okay. Each of these, tribunals basically employed more than 1,000 staff, which I think actually is not enough based on the sheer work that they had to do, right? So let's take a look at some of the organs, right? Okay. So when you look at the organs, right, the first one you take a look at is the chambers. Okay, so what you want to highlight with the chambers is that it's actually what you refer to as trial chamber and the appeals chamber, right? And what you want to explain, right, is that the judges, they came from a variety of legal systems, right? When you watch the video, you will see they are from different nationalities, right? And some of them are permanent, some of them are temporary. They get rotated around also, right? And the rationale is that they mandated, we want it to be fair, right? So we're not going to have any judges, two judges that are from the same state, right? In case these judges then function as representatives of the state, which may have a particular agenda to support or not support, a particular, state or particular individual, and so on, right? So there's the fairness, associated with it. The judges basically, they are responsible, to ensuring that each trial is fair, right? Basically, they follow the rules of procedure and the rules of evidence, which is like the rights and the obligations of all of those involved to a fair in an international trial, right? The problem, with the chambers, right? When you look at the chambers, wait, does it go on to the next slide? Hold on, Why is it not moving? Okay, sorry. Let me finish off this. The problem with the chambers, right, is that in terms of design, all right, there was a criticism of it being quite myopic, right, short-sighted, in the sense that there were a very small number of judges in each of the trial chambers and the appeals chambers. There were 3 judges in each of the trial chambers, right, and 5 judges in each of the appeals chambers. If you read Kant's Means and Styles, right, they will detail this for you. Even the website also will detail it, right? So basically the idea is that you've got so many cases to deal with, right? And you've got many, many individuals who are awaiting trials. And you've got so few judges, right? 3 in each trial chamber and 5 in the appeals chamber. How are you going to finish, right? Doing, going through all of the different cases, right? So that is, one of the main criticisms, okay? Then moving on to the Office of Prosecutor. All right, okay. The Office of Prosecutor, initially until about 2003, they shared the same prosecutor, right? Prosecutor, I would say, is actually quite, significant, right, in the entire discussion of the tribunals, even in the ICC also, right? Fatu Bensouda, who was the chief prosecutor, was basically the face of ICC as well, right? So basically what the function of the Office of Prosecutor is that they are supposed to conduct investigations. So they open investigations, conduct investigations, right? And then they start building up the cases, right, gathering all the evidence, and they build up the cases, right, and then they present it, to the trial chambers, right, and they act, as a separate organ of the tribunal, right, to ensure that, why they are mandated to act separately, right, is that they are not to seek or receive instructions from any government or from any other source. So that's why they are mandated to act independently of the entire tribunal. So basically the idea is that there should be no interference, right, in the conduct of these investigations and the gathering of the evidence, right? So that is, the important point out here, right? And the UN Security Council basically says, that your UN member states, right, if you are a member of the UN, you are subject to the the legality surrounding this, right? So you're under obligation to cooperate with the OTP, the Office of Prosecutors, investigations and prosecutions. So this was another issue why you have member states, right, in the ICC who why you have states in the states who do not want to be member states of the ICC. Sorry, I rephrase. This is why, all right, you have states who are fearful of becoming member states of the ICC because they do not want to be part of it, right? They do not want to have that obligation to respond and to cooperate with the OTP, right? Okay. So same logic down here. The Office of Prosecutor, right, they are supposed to investigate the crimes and they are supposed to present the cases, right? So subsequently, once they conducted all the investigations, and they wrapped up that part of their work, right? Then they shifted focus to presenting the cases at the trial for prosecution. Okay. And basically, what you want to explain, right, is that the chief prosecutor, right, like I said, is the face of the ICC, right, the figurehead, right, or the representative, right, and whichever lawyer that is there is like the basically the one who provides all the details to the press and explains what are the rationale for the investigations and so on. You've got several different divisions like the prosecution division, the investigations division, appeals and legal advisory division, and the information evidence support section, right? If you look at the the last one, the information and evidence support section. I mean, all are important, right? But the last one in particular is very important, right? Because remember I mentioned to you, when the tribunals wrapped up, right, you have the transfer of the remaining cases to the mechanism and to the domestic courts, right? So this is where it becomes important, because when you transfer the cases to the domestic courts or to the mechanism, they need to transfer all the evidence and the information as well, right? So the organization and the material that is collected during the investigation, right? And can be used as evidence, right? Is basically placed with the IEES, right, for storage management, easy retrieval. So this becomes extremely important, right? So if they get it wrong at this stage, right, then how do you continue to try the cases at the mechanism, or how do you continue to try the cases domestically? Okay. All right. Registry was the one I was also explaining to you, right? It's the bureaucratic backbone, so the like what we typically refer to as the secretariat, right? Okay. And it's very diverse, right? They basically, central to the functioning of the ICTY, ICTR, right? And basically, they oversee the budget. Basically, they take care of the detainees as well, right? So the transportation of the witnesses, the protection, any legal aid that is necessary for either the victims, right, or for those that are on trial, right? So it ensures, the idea is that why is legal aid necessary? Why is it that maintaining the health of the individuals who are being tried necessary? Because the rationale is that even though they've been accused of these war crimes, the rationale is that they must be duly represented, right? They must be taken care of, right? Like I said, innocent until presumed guilty. Innocent until convicted, right? So the rationale is that they assign defense counsels, right, to those who also cannot afford. So if you're looking, of course, if you look at the president or the prime minister or these leaders of the military and so on, they'll be well enough. But if you're trying a foot soldier, right, or you're trying a particular individual, right, who has been tasked to carry out the genocide, how are they wealthy enough to drum up financial support for a representative, right, a council, right, to represent them, defense counsel to represent them, right? So that's basically the one part of the role of the registry. The other one is a diplomatic function, right? Say for example, they help to communicate between the tribunal and the international community, or they establish a relationship between the tribunal and the host country, right? So the ICTY was hosted in Netherlands, right? ICTR was hosted in Tanzania, right? So they cultivate a relationship. So like that, like they are the public face, like the PR arm, of the ICTY, ICTR. Okay. All right. Okay, this is the one that I was telling you just now, right, about the UN detention unit, right? When you watch the video, you would look, you would be able to have a quick look at how the detention unit looks like, right? Registry also supervises the detention unit, right? They are all housed. All those accused are housed at the UNDU, right, during the trial, right? And they spend the pre-trial period in detention, right? And like what I mentioned just now, the last point, very important, please highlight that all accused are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Okay, all right. So it's very different from the UN. The UNDU is different from jail, right? Because the rationale is that the jail or prison, right, is reserved for convicted criminals, whereas the UNDU is basically thinking about, okay, you've got to ensure that they're well taken care of, right, and that they meet the highest international standards for detention, right? Unlike you look at the appalling conditions in many prisons and many jails, right? And sometimes you even have innocent who are being placed in that, right? This is actually completely different, right? Maybe because it comes under the auspices of the UN, right? So therefore, you've got these ideas related to it. Okay. All right. Okay. So you've got the idea of looking at the tribunals, right, vis-a-vis domestic jurisdiction, right? So what you want to explain, right? And this argument here is very important. Can you please put an asterisk on this slide down here? It's extremely important, right? This was part of what I mentioned to you in the overview about the institutionalization and the empowerment, right, and how they are considered to be powerful, right, over and above domestic courts, right? And this is very important. Can you please write down there? Important in explaining empowerment or institutionalization of the ICTY and ICTR, right? That's one part of it. Second part is that this argument is also important when you want to talk about how, yeah, where it's important, is it? Okay, where this is important is when you talk about the empowerment and the institutionalization of these two ad hoc tribunals. That means why, right, is ICTY, ICTR so significant? How are they empowered? Second part, right, or where you can use this is to show how this same empowerment is not found in the ICC. Okay, so this is why this argument is very important. Okay, because it explains one about the effectiveness of the ICTY, ICTR. Two, it explains the lack of effectiveness of the ICC. Okay, all right. This is why this is important. It's a very important argument. I would say that no discussion on any of these in this entire unit. In this entire chapter, that means a chapter that talks about the tribunals, right, or the ICC, can go without discussing this. Okay, so very important. Okay, all right. I kind of explained it to you already. All right, but let me just run through some of the ideas related here. Okay, so what is the status of ICTY, ICTR vis-a-vis the domestic courts? Right, basically, all right, you've got the idea where in the ICC, what you have is the Rome Statute that backpedaled or undid whatever powers that were available to the ICTY, ICTR. That is the important issue. We will explore the Rome Statute when we look at the ICC, right? But that is what you want to highlight, right? So in the case of the ICTY and the ICTR, right, they basically had the rationale, right, where, say for example, if you look at Article 9.1 of the ICTY, right, you have the International Tribunal and National Courts shall have concurrent jurisdiction, right, to prosecute persons for serious violations, right? So the rationale is that either the ICTY or the national court, right, they are basically on par with each other. So you got an international court that basically is transboundary, right, that is on an international level, right, and it's no longer a case where only the national court of a sovereign state, because if it's a national court, then it's to do with sovereignty, right? So if this one is international, but it still enjoys the same privileges, then you are, addressing the idea of, how do we understand the logic of sovereignty already, right? We're tweaking the idea of sovereignty, right? So the ICTY or the National Court is able to investigate, prosecute these international crimes, right? So why this becomes important is that your ICTY basically has got primacy over your national courts or your, the states, because you are now referring to international law, right? Your national law can say, I'm a sovereign state, I do not want to give up this criminal. But international law stipulates that this person has conducted crimes against humanity or crimes of aggression, and therefore the ICTY has got the ability to try him, right? Whereas in other cases, the national court can say, no, you have no jurisdiction, you have no ability to intervene in the domestic affairs of the state. So that's why we say it has got primacy. All right, okay. And this is, where, remember I said earlier on, if you're a UN member state, you're obligated. So it's linked to that idea, right? So the very fact that a UN member state makes you obligated. If the ICC or the Office of Prosecutor wants to open up an investigation, you've got to listen, right? You've got to comply. You're obligated to do so, right? And this becomes problematic with the ICC. The Rome Statute of the ICC basically, right, they say, no, we need to change it. We need to make it principle of complementarity, right? So we take away this very significant power, right, from the ICC, which was enjoyed by the ICTY and ICTR, because they felt that remember I mentioned the temporal and the state spatial jurisdiction, right? The fact that it's permanent, the fact they can investigate into anything past a particular date, right? Anything, you can open up an investigation, right? Once it's past a particular date, like I think it was 2001, like I mentioned, right? And basically that threatens, right, a lot of states. to say that, that means anything I do past this date can be opened up, into an investigation, and I'm therefore obligated to do so. So we need to dumb down in very stereotype. I mean, in a very, if you want to be angry about it, right? You could write it that like that. I wrote it as diluted, right? But if you wanted to emphasize on it, right, it gets dumbed down, right? Under the ICC, right, via the the Rome Statute and the principle of complementarity. Okay, so this is an important argument. Please make sure you're familiar with it. All right, so that when you're looking at the ICC, right, you can better piece things together. Okay. All right, let's look at the effects, right, of the ICTY and ICTR. So I would say they're very unique. I know very rarely, we describe, any of the organizations we've looked at in this way, right? They're truly unique, right, in the sense that, they paved the road for the ICC, right? And a lot of observers highlight, if you did not have the ICTY and ICTR, right, and they did not do the work diligently the way they did, and prove that these are the successes, right, it would have been highly unlikely that you would have had the creation of the ICC eventually, right? And the ICC, is basically critical to the legal regime that that we enjoy today, right? Okay, so the rationale is that they were very heavily criticized, even though they were operating at their peaks, trying their level best, right? The most salient criticisms, obviously, is related to the costs, right? Then you've got the politics of international criminal justice, meaning that how fair have these actually been, all right? Okay, and what is the real effectiveness? That means at the end of the day, did they indeed deliver justice to the victims? Indeed, did they manage to help to pave the way for reconciliation and recovery? Did they actually function as any kind of deterrent at all, and so on, right? So that is basically the criticism. So maybe you want to write down there in the slide, right? That the three sub bullet points: the cost, the politics, effectiveness, right? If you're going to critique the organizations, this would be the themes by which you make your arguments. So these are the large arguments. You park all your evidence and your arguments under these major themes. Okay? All right? Quite simple. You can use this idea here again, replicate it under the ICC. All right? So that means the cost of the ICC, any kind of politics related to it, the politicking related to it, and how they are effective in terms of really delivering justice and so on. Okay? So the same idea you can apply. That's why I say themes are very useful in your arguments, because number one, they organize your arguments, right? So it's actually clearer, better. The arguments are all structured, according to, like he said, nicely packaged, right? Makes it easier for the marker to read and identify what are the good points. When you're writing, it's all helter skelter all over the place, right? It's difficult for the marker to identify. That's why I always tell people, if you are comparing two things, right, compare in an organized way, because you want to show cleanly how the comparison looks like. Then the marker can identify. If it's jumping all over the place, it makes it difficult for the marker to read. The more difficult it is for the marker to read, right, the less the lesser inclined they are to score you very well, right? Because the argument is convoluted, right? You've got a lot of cancellations and things like that. So please think carefully, right, about how you are structuring your arguments. Okay. All right. Let's look quickly at some of these things, right? Okay. So when you look at the cost, like what I mentioned to you earlier on, right, the cost is extremely high, right? It costs the member states, at about, okay, sorry, I don't know how to read that figure. Is it 301 million? Right? Yeah. Okay. Is it? Yeah. Okay, 301 million, and over 2 million, right? 227 million, right? In terms of the ICTR, right? Basically, is this the kind of money the international community has, right, to blow on these kinds of issues, right? So the enormous budgets, right, according to the critics, is unjustified, right? Because they basically feel that you've got very meager results, right? Only 90 something people have been tried, right? So does it really correspond? They feel that if you had spent that much money, then we expect to see more cases being completed. But like I argued earlier on, right? The rationale is that, can you place a price on human life? right? So, to say that we expect to see more cases being, dealt with, for the amount of money you spent, right? But the rationale is that even if you spent even, that amount of money, right, and you only manage to solve or try and sentence 5 individuals, means you got 5 individuals justice, right? uh, wouldn't that also be impactful, right? Of course, it depends on perspective, right? I mean, if you're not paying the money, then you would say it's impactful, right? But also the rationale is to also consider, right? Like I said, there's some kind of balance to be had. But admittedly, I mean, it is a lot of money, lah, right? Okay. So, over 20 years of work, right, these performances were deemed to be somewhat disappointing, right? Okay, so that's what you want to highlight. So, like I say, position it as such that this is what the critics say, right? Rather than to say that you are saying, that, it is, they spent too much money, right? I would say that the critics say, right, that they've got meager, disappointing results. And then if you would want, you can add on your own point, right? But don't stretch it too much, right? Just maybe say that, we also need to consider, right, how much impact this makes in terms of, laying down a specific price for lives that have been lost, right? So, can we really measure in the true sense of it? But don't stretch that point too much, right? Don't stretch it too much. Don't make that the central argument, right? But that is something that you can include. So it shows the marker that, you thought about these kinds of issues as well, right? Okay. All right. So these are some of the facts and figures. I just put it in, because interesting, okay, to take a look at, right? So you look at the cost, right? That you want to think about how it is not the same as regular criminal proceedings in domestic courts, for regular issues, right? So stakes are extremely high, especially if you're looking at the high profile cases, that who are basically being tried, right? So the rationale is that if you're going to sacrifice due diligence, right, simply for speed, for increasing the number of cases, then that will bring about another bunch of criticisms. The critics will say that, you're all just basically trying everybody and anybody for the sake of trying, right? It's not you've not done your due diligence, and you have meted out victors' justice and so on. Like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Basically, the idea here, right? So, the rationale is that, it's a criticism that is acceptable, right? And there is just there's justification for the criticism, but we also need to think about why they basically spent that much money, right? And they did scale down their operations. It's not like it was a bloated bureaucracy. It's not like a registry, employed 1,000 and then employed more than 1,000 people, right? Where they felt that they were winding down already, they basically scaled down, the size of the staff as well, and then they handed over the duties to the mechanism, right? So it's not to say that it's bloated, it is a drain on resources and so on, right? Okay. The other argument, which is on politics, right? So of course, remember, if you take, okay, so this is where you would include, remember just now when I made the argument about the realist argument and the Marxist argument and so on, right? About the logic down here, right? Maybe you could think about it in this way, right? When you talk about how they have operated in a very highly charged international environment, right? You're looking at how a lot of these decisions to moot any of these prosecutions are inherently political in nature and so on, right? So the rationale is that when you look at some of these individual cases, some critics basically would say that, it is politically motivated, or it's aligned with the interests of particular great powers and so on, right? So when you look at the criminality of the Nato bombings in former Yugoslavia, right, the OTP basically, came up with a report in 2000, right? And they say that, there was no evidence that NATO airstrikes had deliberately targeted civilians or they had unlawfully targeted military targets, right? And they said that, we admit that NATO may have made some mistakes, right? When on the part of these airstrikes and so on, right? They say that there's no basis for opening an investigation, right? So how come when NATO does it, there's no basis for opening an investigation? But when it occurs in the case of other individuals, right, they should open an investigation. The rationale is that more than 70 plus people were killed, right? In the last two instances, there were villages that were destroyed, right? There were, individual civilians who were killed off, right? So, the rationale here is that, how it is an uneven application. And if it's an uneven application, does it have anything to do with the fact that, NATO is the subject of investigation? Right. Okay. So that is, where you have the politicking, right? ICTR, refusing to investigate particular crimes, perpetrated by the Rwandan Patriotic Army, right? Okay. So, basically, that all of these criticisms, right, highlighted how impartial, how neutral, right, was, these tribunals actually, right? And then, likewise, if the ICC was, created in the similar veins, right, there's this same issue of impartiality and lack of neutrality applied to the ICC, because if you look at the criticisms of the ICC, right, basically what the issue actually is that the ICC has been criticized by a lot of African states, and the African Union and several African states have actually threatened to withdraw from the ICC. Some of them have actually gone ahead and withdrawn. They call it, rather than call it International Criminal Court, they call it African Criminal Court, because they say that 90% or majority of all your cases, right, are all from the African states. I have a video for you that we will watch, next the next time we meet, right, when we talk about ICC. The Rwandan foreign minister basically says, and she points out, she cuts off the interviewer and she says, "Tell me, where is the white man who is being tried, right, in the courts? I don't see any white man being tried. It's basically you are just, using the court, right, as a neo-colonial tool against all of us, right? Because, when y'all do it, it's correct, but when we do it, it's wrong, right? So that's where the politicking logic comes into the picture, right? So, that is a slight problem, a criticism, okay? All right. In terms of impact on the territories concerned, right, the logic really is that, like I mentioned to you earlier on, right? Basically, if you're looking at things like genocide, right? What is the deterrent function? Basically, what is the idea, right, about addressing the root causes of this structural violence? Maybe you want to write that down, right, down here. Right, because that's basically what the idea perpetuates, right? So if you're thinking about the logic of the broad mandate, right, that the ICTY, ICTR, and then subsequently the ICC, basically have, right, thinking about trying international crimes or crimes against humanity, right? So the logic is that look at the horrors that they have experienced, right? How do can you imagine any kind of circumstance, right, in which national reconciliation that is mooted or created by an external international organization, right? How does it how do you expect it to actually work, right? When you're looking at all of this interpretation of of these of these crimes and the interpretation of the law, right, and the evidence on a case by case basis, right? How does it basically contribute to the rebuilding of these societies, right? So the ICTY eventually was actually accused, right, of attempting to perpetuate a lot of these divisions, right? And when it drives a wedge between these tribes or these individuals, then basically how do you move forward and say that, oh, we've tried all of these individuals, now you can move forward, you can have peaceful coexistence. It doesn't remove the root cause of the hatred, or doesn't remove the root cause of any of these problems associated with it, right? So, or why they even had the genocide in the first place, right? So that is a big problem I see with any of these that's why I say too romanticized, too rosy a view, right? While you can punish them, does it really contribute to rebuilding? Okay. So basically, this one here, right, the first point that we highlight is really like the main argument, right, is that it advances the international legal regime, right, with respect to international criminal law, right? It has fleshed out the norms, the rules, the procedures, right? And basically, it has made us think, differently subsequently about what the foundations of international politics and international law is basically about, right? So it is really a case where states may be unwilling to cooperate, states may be unwilling to hand over their war criminals, right? But at the end of the day, right, what what do we have? We have an international organization that is establishing and interpreting, like what I mentioned at the very beginning, what are the acceptable standards for human behavior, right? What are the rules of membership and rules of behavior, right? So if you have uncooperative states, if you have belligerent states, right, then what you have is these states who run the risk, right, of being seen as transgressors on an international level, right? So that's the issue down here, right? So, you also have the rationale about, moving past the domestic criminalization and prosecution of international crimes, where you've got the primacy of international law, primacy of international organization, right, that is supposed to be far more neutral. Because, say, for example, if it's a domestic national court, right, and if you have an instance of genocide, who's going to be the people, right, who are running the domestic courts? Where do the lawyers come from? Where do the judges come from? You're not going to get an entirely unbiased approach to trying the crimes, right? Especially if they come from a majority, if they're majority versus minority, right? And the majority ethnic group is the one that committed the genocide against a minority ethnic group. But your majority ethnic group is also what it comprises government and what comprises the arms of government. Are you going to have a fair trial? Are they even going to have a trial in the first place or not? Versus an international organization that is staffed with neutral, supposedly neutral, right? Independent evaluators and so on, right? Remember, say no two judges in the trial chambers are from the same country, right? And they, run all that money into, so run up the high cost, right? Run up the bill by investigating and ensuring due diligence and so on. So the vast difference, right, of trying these crimes, especially those related to genocide, right, on an international level versus domestic level, completely different impact, right? Okay, so that would also be, the one of the positive effects, right? And then you've got other there's been claims that the UN ad hoc tribunals, they've contributed to the deterrence, which I kind of already argued about earlier on, right? So think a little bit more carefully about the deterrence that that you want to highlight, right? And then you also want to explain that remember the logic of individualized guilt, right? It doesn't matter whether you are a prominent member of society within that state or not. There's accountability that is to be had, right? And also there by doing so, right, in both the Rwandan genocide and the genocide in Yugoslavia, the crimes against humanity in Yugoslavia, it basically establishes an important record, and a record that is fulfilled by first-hand accounts and delivery. It is not an interpretation where a white journalist, right, goes in and interprets events according to a particular worldview and so on, right? Okay, it is given the voice to the citizens and to the individuals, right? And basically strengthen the rule of law in the region, right? Okay, so basically like what I highlighted to you, right? Has it made any genuine inroads in promotion of democracy, or and has it basically contributed to the relief of the individuals who went through the crimes, right? Or does it have a reliving of the horrors, like I mentioned to you earlier on, right? And having to prove it somehow at the end of the day. Okay, and then the last one down here on this slide, right, it's just some examples, right? So like I said, the Xinjiang one I wouldn't include, in this because that was independent, right? But several of these others, right, have been established by the governments or have been mooted by the UN. Say, for example, the one in East Timor, Dili, right? And then the other one that is also quite significant is the Phnom Penh one, right? Okay, the extraordinary, the Cambodia, right? The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia in Phnom Penh, right? So these are the ones, you would say that, are supported, mooted, right, by, UN and so on. Okay? All right. So that's basically, what I wanted to explain to you about ICTY, ICTR. So use the ICTY, ICTR, right, as a foil to ICC, in arguments relating to humanity, in arguments relating to the UN being significant, in arguments relating to international legal regime and so on. There are many, many different ways you can, use this chapter, right? But like I said, take it with a pinch of salt. Be careful. Don't overly romanticize the arguments as much as you are tempted to. And even when on the other hand, right, when you do want to critique, make sure that your arguments are structured, as in, like, don't say that, oh, they spent so much money, and but why have they spent money? Right. Okay. So think about it. That's why I say maybe you want to write down there to remind yourself, play devil's advocate when you're looking at the material, right? And then come to a conclusion. Important, come to a conclusion. Please don't just play a devil's advocate and just leave it as that. Because some students, forget, and then they, just leave it at that because they feel they presented all the different arguments. Okay. All right. I will see y'all the week after. Right, for ICC, which is our second last lecture. All right, to all those who are celebrating New Year, enjoy yourself. Have a good, safe New Year. To those who are not celebrating, just sleep in and watch TV and do some revision. Okay, see y'all. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye.